You are listening to a Sustainable World Radio podcast. Sustainable World Radio brings you in-depth interviews, news, and commentary about exciting, creative, and innovative ways of living. Produced in Santa Barbara, California, Sustainable World focuses on positive solutions to environmental challenges, solutions that adhere to the permaculture ethics, earth care, people care, fair share. Are you interested in learning more about permaculture projects around the globe, how to plant a food forest, restorative design, or ethnobotany? Then stay tuned to Sustainable World Radio. I'm Jill Cloutier. This is an interview with Warren Brush, permaculture designer and educator and co-founder of Quail Springs, Learning Oasis, and Permaculture Farm. Tell our listeners a bit about the work that you have been doing in Africa and around the world.
I'm really fortunate to have a life where I've been able to follow a lot of my heart calling and following the patterns that present themselves in my life to fully express the gifts that I have. And one of the things that's happened recently in these last few years is that I've been asked to bring some of my teachings and the teachings I share of permaculture to different parts of the world and also different parts of the United States. And that's been really a joy, from moving from being in the Santa Barbara, Central California region to these other parts of the world where not only am I bringing things to people, but I'm also retrieving things to bring back home to share with the folks here. In the last, it was about 4 years ago, almost 5 years ago now, that I had a series of synchronicities which showed and pointed that I was to go to Liberia, and after the Civil War had ended there, and a wonderful work of a group called Everyday Gandhis had been already established there, and they were doing healing work around the grief from the war, the 15-year Civil War, brutal Civil War that happened there. And one of their elders had talked about, one of the elders from the villages in which they're working had talked about how they needed to bring back the healing of the land to coincide with the healing of the people. They were doing all this work to heal the hearts of the people, but they realized that the land had been brutalized as well during the war, and also the war of commerce that's been waged on much of the African continent and actually all over the world. And I believe that commerce is actually a form of war. I think that there's always been commerce, but there's been a point where it was considered, the way it was done was more of what people would call sacred commerce, and they would be doing it where the commerce would exchange. There would be the exchange that would happen, but the story of it was intact, and the respect for all of the resources that were involved in whatever was being exchanged was also ensured in the story. And I think things have changed quite a bit since that. So the elder that was there in the village put the call out that this needed to have happened, and a series of dreams happened where they saw someone coming and sharing different teachings around how to heal the land. A lot of the elders in the communities there had been perished during the war, and so there was a real vacuum and a hollow place that needed to be filled, and they didn't feel they had the capacity any longer to see how to bring back a badly damaged landscape. So that led to a series of synchronicities that led to me, and they dreamed that I would come there and bring these teachings of permaculture into this very remote place in northern Liberia. And that began a series of events that led to my work really expanding throughout, not just in Liberia, but also down into East Africa and Kenya and Uganda.
And for listeners who may not have heard our previous interview, perhaps you can talk a bit about how you're a mentor, you're a storyteller. How would you say that has helped or contributed to your work in permaculture?
You know, I believe that in our brains, our bodies, our cellular memory, our very musculature has developed over eons of time in cultures that use story to transfer information, used speech and language to actually formulate the physical world around them. And that may seem somewhat esoteric to some, but I really, if you look at the physics of it, that light, where light and sound come together, is what physics shows is where matter exists. And so our speech is so important in being able to formulate and actually give life or to take life. And part of what I'll refer to the rest of this interview is Western syndrome, how the Western syndrome has moved around the world, has been to actually remove the stories from people and to conquer the languages of people, to separate them from the landscape in which their ancestors have brought to life through their very words. And so when I look at how storytelling in my life has contributed to my work now that I do in my dance with permaculture, is that it's allowed me to speak to the ways people have learned for so many years, so that they can recognize what I'm bringing and sharing with them in many different levels. If I just bring it in a didactic manner from like we get it in school and just deliver it in that way, without the story, without the association, without the literally the beautiful speech that can be associated with science and with understanding of culture and with the journey we're making now out of this crazy time that we're living in, it's an important and crucial aspect in being able to literally help people shift into a place of hope. And so I find the stories that I tell are allow people to actually link their story sometimes with stories that are older than them, and also hopeful stories that maybe envision beyond them as well. And so that's where I bring in stories from all over the world into the work I'm doing, and I gather the stories as well and share them all over everywhere I go.
So tell us a bit, let's go back. You were speaking about Liberia and your work, I think in Kenya recently. Yeah. What would you like our listeners to know about some of the work that you were doing in Africa?
Well, it's a lot of people look at the African continent and they immediately think of poverty. They think, the Sally Struthers TV ads with the little baby that's, with the protruding stomach who's starving, which is there in Africa. But when I think of the message that I want to bring around the work in Africa, and just to share a little bit more about it, is that I feel that the African continent has a lot to teach us right now. And I feel that that if you think of going there and it's an aid project, we really, you shouldn't go there then. I don't think that aid is, there's a wonderful book called, I think it's Dead Aid, that came out recently in the last few years, and it describes how the failure of the aid system has been and how it's created incredible dependencies, and it's been like religion was for many years, the doorway for commerce to come in. And I feel that we have to look at it in a whole new way, because when I go there and I'm teaching a permaculture course, what we do is we invite students from anywhere in the world to come and, so at Ruzinga Island or the other place that I taught at called Niambani Village, which we could talk about later, but when we do the courses there, or in Liberia, which is coming up this August, anybody around the world can come to it, and you go to this place and we share multiculturally from many different perspectives. So one, the students from the West, quote unquote the West, come in and they get a chance to share about what the West is like. They also get a chance to learn what other places that aren't considered the West are like. And there's this great back and forth that starts to happen. One thing that I think is so neat that comes out of this, or so powerful, is that basically the myth that everything Western ends in a glorious future is dispelled right off the bat. So the people there are culturized to idolize things, of the West. Some people wear cell phones around as necklaces, and they don't even work. The cell phones don't work, but just to have one there is something that is a status symbol for some people. And when we start to get these cross-cultural classes coming, the local people realize that, one, the message of permaculture is applicable no matter whether you're in Montecito, one of the richest places in America, or Beverly Hills. It's just as applicable whether you're designing your life with nature or not, as it is in a place that's, heavily degraded landscape and, quote unquote poverty-stricken area like Rusinga Island. You find that a lot of myths get dispelled from both peoples, and so that's one of the reasons why we actually started to run these courses as international courses. We found that the learning capacity of everybody was so much more open when we had all these people together. And that has led to these really successful courses starting to happen around Africa. And we've, like the Badalisha course that we had just a couple months ago, we had students from Sweden, America, Austria, England, Australia, then all over East Africa. We had students from Rwanda, we had students from Uganda, from Tanzania, and then all over Kenya. And then we had all of the students that came internationally paid for the course on more of a higher amount that helped to sponsor all these other students from around East Africa to come. And then there was about 8 local people from Rusinga Island who also took the course. And so 26 people altogether were in the course, and it was absolutely wonderful. And the learning that happened was so, I'm still getting emails from the students that have gone to it saying, this, I've also learned this applies in my life, or that applies in my life. And interestingly enough, we're finding that the courses that are run this way, the students are coming out with a lot more, especially the African students, are coming out with a lot more realistic look about what the West is all about. And that, I think, is an important outcome to have, because we're realizing, we sat one day with the founder of Badalisha, and we were sitting one day and we designed an aid course for America that Africans would teach, because we realized that it was, one, the community dynamics that they have there, the understanding of every man, woman, and child there, how to grow food, how to grow gardens. Even if they're not farmers, everybody knows how to grow seeds, plant seeds, grow the food, how to store food, how to cook the food that's locally appropriate. And that's something I don't find in the West. That's something I don't find in America or in Europe. And so I'm really excited that we can harvest some of that information from it. And it was so funny with the aid course idea, because it went into all these other areas of, how can you grow your food and not have an intact honoring system of the elders and mentoring through from the elders to the young ones. Like, that is integral into growing food. And a lot of Americans will say, no, that's separate. That's a whole different thing. But it's interesting. I think they're onto something, and have been for a long time. So we have a lot to learn from each other. And honestly, there's no such thing as aid anymore in my mind. It's about growing relationships, because we are interdependent in this earth. You cannot say that you're separate and that's something they're doing and we're doing this. It's like, no, there's threads that can get you. You can always find the link. You can always find the patterns that interweave, even all the way around the other side of the world. And most people here in America don't even realize how many things in their life are actually affecting the people that are there. A lot to ponder.
And as we were discussing earlier today about this interview, you were talking a bit about, and this kind of goes into what you were just saying, how America, really, we have a lot to learn from the Africans and maybe people of other cultures, because we really are in a time of change here. And could you speak a bit about that?
Well, the time of change, you have to be pretty much have no senses, not being able to see, feel, touch, or hear, or even have intuition of any sort, to not feel the changes that are upon the earth right now. And I hear a lot of people talk about, well, that's, maybe now, people that were really reticent to even say anything, they're now saying, well, maybe there's something amiss. And you have to be blind not to see it. I mean, especially, like, I start to look at places like East Africa that are being raped and pillaged by the West right now, and they're literally, I mean, it is incredible how much of the natural resources there and in Liberia that are being extracted for us to maintain this unsustainable level of consumption that we are, I guess, feeling entitled to. I hear a lot of people say we're entitled to it, and yet they don't have to see what's happening over in these other places. But even more than that, we're in a time where even with the consumption, you can see and feel in these communities that the lack of substance culturally, we're missing that. And something with us filling a hollow place that used to be filled by a healthy culture around us, we're trying to fill with consumption. And that is, when we hit a critical point right now in history where we have to start to reseed culture, or humanity, I don't believe, is going to make it. And I don't think, like you and I and the people listening to it, we're never going to see it intact again. We're never going to see culture intact again. It takes, all the elders in my life have said it takes 200 years. It takes great-grandmothers growing up with great-grandmothers who were babies together for us to be able to really root culture in place. And when I talk about culture, a lot of people say, oh, the American culture. My definition wouldn't fit with America. The definition I use of where culture comes from is that it's a group of people who knows where all that sustains them comes from, and they honor those things deeply. And that's not esoteric as it sounds. If you really think about it, if you and all the people around you in your valley, in your watershed, knew where everything came from, you would start to see, so if your food only came from that valley, what could grow in that valley, the certain soils that were there, the weather conditions, you would start to have a cultural food imprint that was very unique to that valley, and the next valley over it would be different, a little different, and then miles away it would be very different. Same with clothing. Imagine that, if all your clothing came from that, and what you had there, you would have a unique, the dyes that you could find in the plants in your valley would be very unique. You'd have unique colors that, somewhere 200 miles away might not have, or somebody at a higher elevation might not have, or, whatever that is. And same with music. You'd be attuned. Your brain would actually be developing its musicality from the sounds of that valley. So when I talk about where culture comes from, I really mean it from a very pragmatic, very earth-based understanding, and that literally I believe culture comes from the landscape, and that it comes through the people. And the people are expressions of the culture of that landscape. So if you remove yourself from the story of that landscape, and in a globalized culture, or in a globalized society, or a globalized system of resource gathering and resource use, you no longer are linked to that story of the place in which you dwell. And so, I don't believe that a globalized culture is possible. I think what it is that it removes us far enough from the story to where we can, put rubber on our cars and, not feel the implications of a million acres being sold for $1 an acre in Liberia to the Firestones. It's like years ago, and it's ludicrous. We're really having to learn our story of our connection to all that sustains us, so that the world can live, and that we can live with culture intact. Our children need that kind of hope, and it's not as crazy as it sounds, like, oh, it's going to be so drastic to be able to do this. It's like the local food movements and the local purchasing movements are all, where you buy things locally from local folks. It makes so much sense. It's your neighbors. Don't you want to support them? It's like you go down to Walmart and you spend $1, and that, 90% of that leaves the next day. And then, the next 10 cents is there for a few more days, and then off it goes. But if you give it to a neighbor who made the sweater themselves, and they got the wool from someone growing the sheep in the valley here, that money continues to stay in there, or the exchange continues to benefit the people within your community. And that's what I want. I want to see my neighbors succeed. And when your neighbors succeed, that's when you have security. That's when you have streets that your children feel like they can be safe walking around. That's when you have people no longer needing to express themselves in the void of globalism, but they can actually engage in relationships with the people around them. And that's another lesson I'm learning a lot from our African colleagues is the whole idea of working with your neighbors to meet the needs of survival. Yeah.
And really, it's not very esoteric to me at all. It sounds more grounded, and it's really cultivating your sense of place.
Well, and it's, the times we're in, it's interesting if you look at many different peoples around the world, from the Hopi to the Waitāha of New Zealand, the people before the Maori. You look to the Haida, and on and on, the list goes on, that we're in a time where all of these ancient peoples prophesized about the days we're living right now. And that, to me, is no coincidence. There's never been a time in history where there's been so much prophecy coming to play. And what I'm hearing from different elders in my life is who share and who have been keepers of some of the prophecies that have come out, is that we really need to make drastic changes right now, and that it's a part of it's been foreseen that this is what is needed to have happen, that we have to get back to the earth. We have to get back to being real with our communities. We have to be people who, with our speech and with our incredible ability to create beauty and to touch the world in a beautiful way, we have to feed the world with that beauty, with our beautiful speech and with the beautiful creativity that we have. We have to find joy again. We have to slow down because we've so exceeded our capacity to observe and gather feedback of our actions. We're moving too fast for us to make really good, sound, pragmatic decisions. The most pragmatic people in the world are people that live close to life and death, where they grow their own food, and if they miss a year, they could lose their family. And those people don't make decisions lightly. And I'm finding that they're all talking about, now's the time for us to continue to grow our connections to the land, because we need to survive as a species, and we need to and we need to be conscious about it. Survival can no longer be unconscious for most of us in the West. We have to become conscious and responsible for ourselves right now, and that's where permaculture to me is so hopeful, because I feel like permaculture is saying, look around you. Look at all of the natural systems, all of the natural influences in the land, in the place, in the people, and look at how do you harmonize with that, with the design of your life, and for the design of the settlement of the people around you. How do you harmonize with that? And it makes so much sense, because it's on a pragmatic level, harmonizing with gravity. It's like you can put a pond at the bottom of a hill, but then you'll have to pump the water up to get it anywhere onto the hill. And, if you can initially build the pond higher up the hill, you're working with natural systems. So there's a real pragmatism to it. But it's funny, as I walk around like the city of Santa Barbara, or I've been down in Los Angeles recently, and how unconscious design has taken hold in this world. It totally says we have enough oil to be able to, basically design anything to go, anything outside of the natural systems, because we can use oil to keep it going. Well, that's not going to be here much longer. And even if we had oil for thousands of years to come, is it how we want to live? Is it how we want to design our lives? Do we want to be out of harmonics with all the natural systems? And it goes so against what our ancestors have done. At some point, all of our ancestors, no matter what color skin you are, all lived close to the land, were intact with the land, and until that syndrome hit them. And so we have a lot of, we have it. Everything we need to know lies within us, and we know it's in our ancestral memory. And when we start to do things like building a permaculture garden or designing a permaculture system for our homes, you start to feel that ancestral memory get unlocked, because it's doing things that make sense with the natural systems. And then, of course, there's appropriate technology. We're sitting here today with this little recording device, and we're able to share our stories to, great distances. And I'm really, I believe in appropriate technology joining with us in the design of working with natural systems and living simply. It's there's a whole movement around living simply, and I think it's not something that we're going to have a choice to do soon. We're going to be mandated to do it if we don't start embracing a life that is living close to the land and feeling and seeing the feedback of our daily life, so that we can adjust it, so we know that 7 generations out our children aren't going to suffer from our decisions today. Yeah.
Well, in your work, Warren, too, you've worked with children here in the States, and you've also been working with children around the world in Africa. And if you could share maybe a few stories, or I know that in a past interview we talked about your work with child soldiers, and you're working with children here at Quail Springs. So maybe talk a bit about your work with kids and how you empower them.
I'm a little selfish with this, because I realize too my time with children is really feeding me, and I recognize that. And so I've been very fortunate in the work that we did to start. My wife and I started Wilderness Youth Project back in the mid-90s, and that led us into permaculture, because we found that kids who were getting these incredible experiences in nature were wanting to live that experience out in their daily life in town. And we wanted to see, how do we take those patterns of stewardship, those patterns of integrity with the land, and bring it into how we live in this modern time. And that led me into permaculture. And that with the children has been an important part of being able to teach them the skills it takes to live a life of integrity with the land. And that's something that we're doing in a lot of different ways. We have a program called Sustainable Vocations that we run with Quail Springs, out of Quail Springs, but we actually run it at other sites. So we're running, this year we're going to be doing Sustainable Vocations at the Ojai Foundation, and children from all over the United States are coming, but a lot from Santa Barbara area are coming as well. And that's a special program as well, where we're teaching youth the whole, they're doing the whole permaculture design certification, but they're also learning a lot about how to be in council, how to build community, how to work with making place beautiful, how to express their gifts and find their gifts, how to have a deep connection with their intuition. All of these things that make them really good leaders for these changing times. In Africa, it's been amazing to work with former child soldiers as well, and their stories are stories of things that I have no frame of reference for. I hear some of these kids talk about how their parents were killed right in front of them, and then they were forced to kill other people. And what we're finding is that permaculture is something that they can take back to the communities that they have, that are afraid of them still to this day. A lot of these kids can't even go home because the things that they were forced to do during these times. And so we're finding that permaculture is a way for them to actually make home, and also to bring a gift back to their community that they can help with. So we've been working with former child soldiers through Everyday Gandhis for these last few years, and it's been very successful. I start welling up when I think of what these kids have gone through, and I think about how much their stories, I think, could really help a lot of the kids in America to really understand what it's like to get through challenging times and still come out of it and have to live. And I've seen some of these kids who, everyone I've talked to, none of them say they're a victim. Not a single one have I met. Any of these child soldiers say, I was a victim of this. They say that that this is something that they just need to move beyond, and that but they're not acting like victims. And I find a lot of kids here they take on the victim role of, because they got their, they weren't able to get an iPhone, and their kid next door had an iPhone, and they become a victim and not having what they're entitled to them or whatever. And that's an extreme case, but I find that there's when you start to share the story across between people who have such different experiences, I know there's a lot of learning that takes place, because I see it in myself. And with the kids there in Africa, I've also done some work with a place called Niambani Village, which is a place that 700 children live at who have lost both their parents to HIV. And, so one of the illnesses related to HIV. And so they're dead. Their parents are gone. And these 700 children live in this one village, and we did a permaculture design course there. And we designed up, there's over 70 houses there, and we did one of the designs for the house, and now they're starting to implement it on all 70 houses. And one of the things I saw was the joy that the kids carried, even though they had gone through so much. And I found that they were so open to and really craving the knowledge that was coming through permaculture, which was basically, like a lot of people say when I'm teaching in different places, but especially the kids say, well, this is like what the grandparents used to say, or this is what the elders used to say. And I find that really to be interesting, that it's like this reinvigoration of a part of our ancestry that worked. I'm not going to idolize our ancestors. I don't do that, but there's parts of our ancestry that worked, or we wouldn't be here today. And what I'm afraid of is our story now is going to be to a place where there's a lot of people who, there won't be people to be able to say, my ancestors, they did this, they got us here, And that's kind of the worst thing that could happen, is that you don't pass on the world in a good way. And I certainly don't want that to happen. And so my work with children is just really an important aspect of, I think about it every day, and it's and I work at it every day to try to bring a positive message that allows the kids to step into right action right away. It's not, doesn't matter if you're 2 years old or you're 19 years old or whatever, or an 80-year-old kid. There are things you can do right now to better the world and to better your own life by bettering the world. And it's not esoteric at all. It's planting, it's tending to the waters, it's learning to live in a way that is sane on the ground. People will come out to Quail Springs and they'll say, "Oh, I'm so disconnected. I just want to get connected to nature, And I'll always share the same thing with everybody, is that you're never not connected. And it's your lack of understanding and observation that you aren't connected, that you think you're not connected, that is so dangerous to the world. That you all of a sudden you're in a web of life that you cannot extract yourself from. It is impossible. Doesn't matter where you come from, what your status in life is, what you believe, any of that, and you are a part of the web of life. And every single movement that you do, with your arms, with your speech, with everything you do, you actually tug on that web of life. Now, if you're aware of it, you can tug on it in a way that actually helps to support it and to send waves through that net that are positive and hopeful and real and connected and regenerative. Or you can thrash around like you're not connected and just cause a lot of damage around you without any consciousness of it. So, to recognize first off that you're not ever disconnected from that web of life, and you just can't be. Rest in that and be joyful in that you are connected to things that are so much bigger than you. And that puts you in a big place. We don't have to feel diminished as a people anymore. And it's interesting, a lot of the tracks of the modern Western world especially are of a diminished people trying to prove themselves, and it's destructive, very destructive. We are grand, incredible human beings that have the capacity to feed the world and create beauty, and we just need to step into that. It's time to step into that.
So Warren, you have a lot of work ahead of you and that you've done, and I think what I loved when we were talking earlier, you were talking about the keynote. You're one of the keynote speakers at the IPC 10 in Jordan, and I think you're going to be talking about permaculture and peacemaking in a thirsty world.
Yeah.
And that, if you want to speak a little bit about that.
Yeah. Well, the IPC, that's the International Permaculture Convergence, and this year it's every other year. And last year it was in. Year before last it was in Malawi. This year it's in Amman, Jordan, in the Jordanian area in Jordan, and this year's theme is water, and so I decided to do a keynote address. I've been asked to do a keynote address, and also I'm co-teaching the permaculture course that happens before that, and Bill Mollison will actually be there, which is really exciting. We have Jeff Lawton will be teaching, Brad Lancaster, on and on. The list goes on of incredible teachers that are going to be there, and I'm just one of many. That I'm really fortunate to be with all these heroes of mine, and. But the keynote that they asked me to speak on, and they wanted me to talk about something around mentoring. And I just started to think of peacemaking and permaculture, and how really to be a peacemaker takes an understanding of how to mentor, because you have to be able to have a long-term vision of peacemaking. You have to work with the next generations that are younger than you, and that then led to this idea of permaculture and peacemaking in a thirsty world. And I'm using the thirsty world because the water theme, and how we're thirsty for so many things. We're thirsty for culture. We're thirsty for we're thirsty for interdependence. We're thirsty for the integrity being a part of our day-to-day lives, and we're thirsty for, on and on. There's so many things we're thirsty for, and so I'm going to wrap it into a care of the people, talk about the ethic care of the people, and I'm hoping it'll be something different that people haven't had up to now. I'm approaching it very differently, and I'm actually going to draw from one of my teachers who taught a traditional peacemaking, gratitude, Thanksgiving address, and I'm going to be bringing some of the teachings of the Iroquois into this, which is I shouldn't even let this out, but it's going to be very different, and then also very relevant for where we are in the permaculture movement, because there's a lot of infighting and different things that have occurred, and it happens in every movement. And yet, I don't feel it has to. I feel like it's like it's time for us to rethink how we are dealing with one another as people, and it is a big issue, because people are the ones who are causing so much damage on the earth of any species out there. We're the one that's caused so much ailment in the world.
We are the champions.
Yeah, we are the champions
of the world.
Yeah, and it makes sense that we need to understand how people work, and how we care for people will in turn inspire how people care for the world around them.
And tell, if someone's listening right now and wanted to find out more about your work, get a hold of you, how could they do so?
Well, thanks for asking. People can get a hold of me through one of my websites, which is permaculturedesign.us. So the word permaculture design, and the next word design together, .us is my design firm and education firm that I use, and I've got another website called quailsprings.org, which is our demonstration site. You can't teach permaculture unless you demonstrate it, and so that's the place that is my demonstration site, working with 12 other people that live on the land. We've developed this high desert place, and it's quailsprings.org. We also have Trees for Children, which is, you can look that up as well, and that's .org as well. And if you're interested in the Liberia course, which some of you might be, which is coming up this August, there's a website called peaceandpermaculture.org. They had a recent, 6-7 8 years ago now, they came out of their civil war, and to be able to go to a country that's coming out of a civil war like that's incredible. And it's going to be a wonderful course. And then I'll be going again to Niambani village in Africa, in Kenya, in December, running a course there back at that village. And I want to end on a story. Can I just do that real quick?
Yeah.
So I talk about Liberia and the Civil War, and a lot of people don't know how that war ended. But it ended with, basically after 15 years, the women said, we're done. This is it. Across, people who were from fighting tribes and different things, they were, women came together in all the villages and the cities around the country, and they sat out in the middle of the village squares with bullets and rockets flying over them, and they held signs up saying, the war must end, and they basically committed to ending the war. And so they did two things. They said, they did a few things, but one of them was that they said to all their husbands and boyfriends and all of that we'll no longer sleep with you until the war ends, which had a huge power. They also said, we will no longer eat, and the women of Liberia will die if this war does not end soon. So we're gonna fast. And so they did that, and then they prayed for the elephants, which was another thing which is the harbingers of peace in West Africa. And when the war started, the elephants left. They couldn't find them in Liberia any longer. So within 30 days, the war ended. After 15 years, just imagine that. And it was so powerful. The women were so powerful in that coming together. And then they still, every month, they go and they dance through the streets of their villages and their towns to remind people that there's not going to be another war. And they hold that beautifully. So the story that I want to end on comes on the tail of that, which is last time I was there, I was listening on the radio, UN military radio, and Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, she was democratically voted into power shortly after the end of the war, and she's the first African president who's a woman, and she's great. She's like a great-grandmother, incredible. And she was talking on the radio, and she said, Liberians, if you want to not ever go back into war, there's one thing we can do. If you don't want to be dependent on Western interests taking our natural resources, then there's one thing we can do. And then she said, if we want to keep our children from becoming, child soldiers again in the future, there's one thing we can do. If we want to be independent as a country, there's one. She went on, and I'm like, Ellen, tell me, please, And she finally said it. There's one thing every Liberian needs to do for the security of this country. And she said, that's to grow a garden. You got to grow a garden. And so I leave on that message that, if you can do one thing right now to change the world around you, it's to grow a garden. Just start there, and you'll see as soon as you start doing that your life will change. It's incredible. I am so inspired that all the problems of the world can be solved in the garden.
Thank you so much, Warren.
Thank you. I appreciate it, Jill, once again.
And I had one last thing to add to this interview with Warren Brush, and that is that the elephants did return to Liberia after the war was over. So that's really, really good news. Thanks so much for listening to Sustainable World. Bye-bye. You've been listening to a Sustainable World Radio podcast. For more information or to hear our other podcasts or interviews, visit www.sustainableworldradio.com. Sustainable World Radio is produced by Jill Cloutier. Music by Dana Lyons. Thanks for listening.